In the final, desperate months of the Second World War, the German soldier was a creature of diminishing hope. The Thousand-Year Reich was collapsing into rubble, the Allies were closing in from all sides, and the once invincible Wehrmacht was being reduced to a shadow of its former self. Yet, even in this twilight of defeat, German troops continued to fight with a ferocity that defied logic. But there were moments when the facade of discipline cracked, moments when the psychological armor of the German warrior shattered, revealing the frightened man beneath. One such moment occurred in the spring of 1945 on a lonely road somewhere in the heart of Germany. A panzer commander, a veteran of years of brutal combat, was issuing orders to his crew. Mid-sentence, he stopped. His eyes went wide. The words died in his throat. He had seen the American convoy. It was not the sight of the enemy that shocked him. He had seen American tanks before. He had killed them, and they had killed his comrades. It was the sheer scale of what he was witnessing. It was the impossible abundance. It was the relentless, seemingly endless flow of American military might that rendered his own position utterly meaningless. This moment of frozen horror, of mid-sentence paralysis, was a microcosm of the psychological collapse of the German army. It was the moment when the German soldier realized that the war was not just lost, it was over. And in that realization, he was forced to confront the terrifying truth that for all their training, all their discipline, all their technological prowess, they had been beaten by a logistical system they could never hope to match. This is the story of that moment, a story of tactical shock, psychological warfare, and the crushing weight of industrial power. It is a story that answers the question, why did a panzer commander stop mid-sentence? And what does that silence tell us about the true nature of victory and defeat in the Second World War? To understand why a panzer commander would freeze at the sight of an American convoy, one must first understand the world he came from. The German Panzer commander was a product of a military tradition that prized aggression, discipline, and tactical brilliance above all else. He was the spearhead of the Blitzkrieg, the armored fist of the Third Reich. The Panzer divisions were the elite of the German army. They were equipped with the best tanks, the best crews, and the best leadership. A panzer commander was not just a soldier. He was a knight of the modern battlefield, a master of maneuver warfare. He had been trained to think in terms of speed, surprise, and decisive action. The Blitzkrieg doctrine, developed in the interwar years, was based on the concept of rapid, concentrated armored thrusts. The Panzer Division was a combined arms team consisting of tanks, mechanized infantry, artillery, and engineers. It was designed to punch through enemy lines, exploit breakthroughs, and encircle enemy forces. Speed was the key. The panzer commander had to be able to think on his feet, to make split-second decisions, to keep his forces moving forward. He was trained to be aggressive, to take risks, to seize the initiative. The German tank, particularly the Panther and the Tiger, was a formidable weapon. It was heavily armored, powerfully armed, and capable of defeating any Allied tank in a one-on-one engagement. The panzer commander sat in his turret, surrounded by steel, commanding a machine that represented the pinnacle of German engineering. But this tactical prowess came at a price. German tanks were complex, mechanically unreliable, and difficult to produce. They consumed vast amounts of fuel and required extensive maintenance. The Panzer commander was constantly fighting a war of attrition, struggling to keep his vehicles operational in the face of overwhelming Allied numbers. The American military, in stark contrast, was built on a different philosophy. The Americans believed in mass production, logistical superiority, and overwhelming firepower. The M4 Sherman was not the best tank on the battlefield, but it could be produced in vast numbers. The Americans could afford to lose tanks, the Germans could not. The American convoy that the Panzer commander saw was not just a collection of vehicles. It was a statement of purpose. It was the physical manifestation of American industrial might, a seemingly endless river of steel and fuel and men that demonstrated the irrefutable reality of Allied power. The Germans had been told by their propaganda machine that the Americans were soft, decadent, and lacking in military spirit. The convoy was living proof that this was a lie. The German soldier was also conditioned by a lifetime of propaganda about racial and cultural superiority. He was taught that he was a member of a master race, destined to rule the world. The sight of a massive American convoy challenged this deeply held belief. If the Americans were so inferior, how could they produce such overwhelming force? The cognitive dissonance was unbearable. The Panzer commander had also been taught to believe in the concept of final victory. He was told that the new weapons, the V-2 rockets, the jet fighters, would turn the tide of the war. He had clung to this belief as the Allies closed in. The sight of the American convoy shattered this illusion. He realized that the new weapons could not compensate for the sheer industrial power of the United States. The tactical reality facing the German Panzer commander in the spring of 1945 was grim. His army was outnumbered, outgunned, and running out of fuel. His tanks were breaking down, his crews were exhausted, and his commanders were losing hope. He was fighting a defensive war, reacting to enemy moves rather than dictating the terms of battle. The Panzer commander had been trained to attack. He was an offensive warrior. Now he was being asked to defend, to hold ground against an enemy that seemed to have limitless resources. The psychological strain was immense. The American convoy represented everything that the German army was not. It represented abundance, mobility, and the confidence of victory. It was a symbol of the American way of war, a way that the Germans could not hope to emulate. The Panzer commander who stopped mid-sentence was not just a soldier. He was a representative of a military tradition that had been humiliated and defeated. He was a symbol of the collapse of a regime that had promised everything and delivered only death. His silence was the sound of a world ending. The first American armored convoys that German panzer commanders encountered in the spring of 1945 were unlike anything they had seen before. They were not just military formations. They were mobile cities, vast columns of steel that stretched for miles across the German countryside. The German soldiers who saw these convoys were often stunned into silence. They had grown accustomed to their own diminishing resources, to the shortages of fuel, ammunition, and spare parts that plagued their army. They had seen their own vehicles break down and be abandoned, their crews forced to retreat on foot. Now, they were seeing the enemy's logistical abundance in all its overwhelming glory. The American convoys were a constant presence in the daily lives of German troops. They moved day and night, their headlights cutting through the darkness, their engines a constant rumble that could be heard for miles. The Germans learned to recognize the distinctive sound of American tank engines, the grinding of tracks on paved roads, the low growl of heavy trucks. The initial engagements between German panzer forces and American convoys were often one-sided affairs. The Germans would attempt to ambush a column, using the mobility of their tanks and the protection of their armor to inflict casualties. But the Americans quickly adapted, learning to use their superior numbers and air support to overwhelm any German resistance. In August 1944, during the secret American armored drive in Normandy, a large convoy of German Tiger tanks attempted to escape the advancing American column. The Americans called in dive bombers, and the German convoy was reduced to a smoking skeleton a mile long. A captured German colonel was brought to an American camp, crying and dazed and bewildered by the sudden Allied onslaught. This was a common reaction among German soldiers, who encountered the sheer power of the American armored forces. Another captured German lieutenant who had fought in Russia and Italy described the American attacks during this secret operation as the most terrifying he had ever experienced. It was not just the firepower that terrified them. It was the speed and the relentlessness of the American advance. The German soldiers, who had been told that the Allies were soft and decadent, were now facing an enemy that was more aggressive and more powerful than anything they had encountered. The secret American armored columns in Normandy liberated 20 villages in a single day. They moved so fast that the Germans, in many cases, had no time to respond. The German soldiers who survived these engagements were often in a state of shock. They had been trained to believe in their own superiority. Now, they were witnessing their own defeat. The psychological impact of these encounters was profound. The German soldiers began to question their own training, their own leadership, and their own cause. They began to lose faith in the idea of final victory. They began to see the war as a futile struggle against an unstoppable enemy. The Panzer commander who stopped mid-sentence was a product of this environment. He had witnessed the collapse of his army, the destruction of his comrades, and the relentless advance of an enemy he could not stop. He had been forced to retreat, to abandon his own vehicles, to watch his men die. He had been betrayed by his own propaganda and abandoned by his own government. The sight of the American convoy was the final blow. It was the confirmation of everything he had feared. The enemy was not just winning, the enemy was triumphant. The German soldier was not just losing, the German soldier was irrelevant. The operational realities of the German army in the spring of 1945 made this psychological collapse inevitable. The Germans were running out of fuel, ammunition, and food. Their vehicles were breaking down, and their supply lines were being severed. They were fighting a hopeless battle against an enemy that seemed to have limitless resources. The American convoys were a constant reminder of this disparity. They were the visible proof that the war was lost. They were the symbols of a new world order that had no place for the German soldier. The Panzer commander had been trained to fight, to lead, to inspire his men. Now he was faced with a situation where fighting was futile, leadership was meaningless, and inspiration was impossible. He had no choice but to surrender, to accept the inevitable, to watch his world crumble around him. His silence was the sound of a man who had run out of words, who had run out of hope, who had reached the end of his own personal war. The turning point in the psychological war between German panzer commanders and American armored forces came during the Battle of the Bulge and the subsequent advance into Germany itself. It was during these desperate months that the Germans threw their last reserves into the fight, only to be overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the American response. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 was the last major German offensive in the West. It was a desperate gamble, designed to split the Allied lines and capture the port of Antwerp. The Germans committed their best armored divisions, including the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler and the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend. They used new tactics, including the infiltration of American lines by German soldiers dressed in American uniforms. The offensive achieved initial success, creating a bulge in the American lines. But the American response was swift and devastating. The American convoys continued to flow, bringing reinforcements and supplies to the front. The Germans were unable to match the American logistical capability. Their fuel supplies ran out, their vehicles broke down, and their offensive ground to a halt. The psychological impact of the German defeat was immense. The soldiers who had been told that the new weapons and tactics would turn the tide of the war were now seeing that the Americans were simply too strong. The defeat at the Bulge shattered the myth of German invincibility and destroyed the morale of the German army. The panzer commander who stopped mid-sentence might have been a veteran of the Bulge. He might have seen his comrades die in the snow, his tanks run out of fuel, his dreams of victory evaporate. He might have fought with all his strength, only to be overwhelmed by the sheer number of American troops and tanks. By the spring of 1945, the German army was in a state of collapse. Soldiers were deserting, units were disintegrating, and the chain of command was breaking down. The German soldiers who were still fighting were often motivated more by fear of the SS than by any loyalty to the Nazi regime. The American convoys were a constant reminder of the hopelessness of the German position. They moved through the German countryside, their presence a symbol of the Allied victory. The German soldiers watched them pass, their faces a mixture of fear, anger, and despair. The psychological warfare aspect of the American convoys was not accidental. The Americans knew that the sight of their massive logistical columns would demoralize the enemy. The convoys were a form of psychological warfare, a demonstration of American power that was intended to break the will of the German soldier. The American strategy was based on the principle of overwhelming force. The Americans believed that the best way to win a war was to bring so much power to bear on the enemy that resistance became futile. The convoys were the physical manifestation of this strategy. The German soldier, who had been conditioned to believe in his own superiority, was not equipped to handle the psychological shock of seeing this overwhelming force. He had been told that the Americans were weak, that they would be easy to defeat. Now he was seeing the opposite. The cognitive dissonance was too much to bear. The Panzer commander who stopped mid-sentence was experiencing a moment of profound psychological crisis. His worldview had been shattered. Everything he had been taught, everything he had believed, was being proven wrong. He could not process what he was seeing. He could not find the words to express what he was feeling. The silence was a form of surrender. It was the acknowledgement that the war was over, that the German soldier had been defeated, that the Panzer commander was no longer a warrior, but a victim. The technological and strategic impact of the American convoys on the German war effort was immense. The convoys were not just a logistical necessity. They were a strategic weapon that broke the will of the German army. The Americans had developed a logistical system that was unmatched in the history of warfare. They could move vast quantities of men, equipment, and supplies over thousands of miles of ocean and hundreds of miles of contested territory. The convoys were the arteries of this system, bringing the lifeblood of war to the front lines. The German army, in contrast, was plagued by logistical problems. The Allied bombing campaign had destroyed the German transportation network, reducing the capacity of the railways and roads. The German army was forced to rely on horse-drawn transport, while the Americans were using trucks, tanks, and armored personnel carriers. The American convoys were also a symbol of the industrial power of the United States. The Americans could produce thousands of tanks, tens of thousands of trucks, and millions of tons of ammunition. The Germans could not. The Germans had to rely on captured equipment, slave labor, and the declining output of their war factories. The strategic impact of this logistical disparity was profound. The Americans could afford to take risks, to make mistakes, and to lose battles. The Germans could not. Every German defeat was a disaster. Every loss of equipment was irreplaceable. The American convoys also had a psychological impact on the German leadership. The German generals knew that they could not match the American logistical capability. They knew that the war was lost, but they continued to fight, driven by a combination of ideology, fear, and a refusal to accept defeat. The American convoys were a form of strategic warfare, a weapon that was designed to destroy the enemy's will to fight. The Americans were not just defeating the German army on the battlefield, they were destroying the German army's morale. The Panzer commander who stopped mid-sentence was a witness to this strategic defeat. He was seeing the enemy's logistical superiority in action. He was seeing the physical proof that the Germans could not win. His silence was the sound of a man who had finally understood the nature of the war. It was the sound of a man who knew that his cause was lost, his army was defeated, and his life was over. The silence was the final act of a tragedy that had been unfolding for years. The story of the Panzer commander who stopped mid-sentence at the sight of an American convoy is a story of a moment of truth. It is a story of the psychological collapse of the German army, of the shattering of illusions, and of the brutal reality of defeat. The Panzer commander was not a weak man. He was a veteran of years of combat, a man who had faced death many times. But he was also a man who had been shaped by a culture of militarism, of racism, of blind obedience. When he saw the American convoy, he saw the failure of everything he had been taught to believe. The convoy was a symbol of a different way of life, a way of life that valued abundance, freedom, and individual initiative. It was a way of life that the German people had been told was weak and decadent. But the convoy was not weak. It was strong. It was stronger than anything the Germans could produce. The Panzer commander's silence was a moment of clarity. He realized that the Germans had been fighting the wrong war, that they had been fooled by their own propaganda, that they had been led to their destruction by a madman. In that moment, he was not a German soldier. He was a man who had been betrayed. The legacy of the American convoys is a complex one. They were a symbol of American power and ingenuity, but they were also a symbol of the destruction of the old world order. They helped to defeat the Nazi regime, but they also contributed to the rise of the Cold War. They were a source of pride for Americans, but they were also a source of resentment for many Germans. The question that haunts the history of the American convoys is a simple one. Why did the Germans not surrender sooner? Why did they continue to fight when the war was clearly lost? The answer is as complex as the war itself, involving ideology, fear, and the refusal to accept defeat. In the end, the Panzer commander's silence was a powerful statement. It was the silence of a man who had nothing left to say, who had run out of words, who had reached the end of his road. It was the silence of a man who had finally understood the nature of his defeat. And in that silence, we can hear the echoes of a war that reshaped the world.